Hey everybody, welcome to the last screencast of this unit. Just so you know, we have this screencast and associated questions. Then we'll have a lab that we do when we're back on campus. Then we'll have a review test where I can walk around the classroom and help you with any questions you might have prepping for the test. The test will then be when we come back from lunar, the first day of this class when we're back from lunar. So let's just take it away. Our last topic is really what we've been building up to. It's called soil conservation. So here's the thing. As I've said before, I think most people in the world, even very educated people that I know, do not have any clue of the importance that soils play in the future success of the human species. Like we have to have soils to eat. We're terrestrial organisms. And so basically, the food web of which we partake is for the most part based on land plants that capture sunlight energy. They get their photosynthesis by taking water out of the soil. So no soil, no photosynthesis, no photosynthesis, no plants, no beans, no fruits, no cows, no sheep, no pigs, no nothing. Okay, so we gotta have soils in order to survive. And so it's pretty important for us to understand the mechanisms by which soils are formed and how they can be depleted and degraded. So let's first focus on the simple fact that it takes a long time for soils to form. They form, if you recall, when we talked about primary succession, from the mechanical and chemical weathering of rock material. It breaks down slowly over time, basically leaving us these soil horizons that are basically the bedrock from here through this process has been turned into clay particles, sand particles, and silt particles, and then organic matter that works in. And that's what these plants need. So the thing is, this process of getting from here to here, depending on where we are on the planet, it takes at least hundreds of years, and it can take up to 1,000 or more years. That makes it what we call a non-renewable resource, meaning once we use it, we can't get it back. Like coal, coal is made by natural processes, but it takes millions of years, so we can't get it back. The same thing is true for soils. We need to think of soils as something that we'll never get more of. Sorry about that. And treat them as such. Now, here are the main sources to the world's soils, and I'm going to go through each of them in turn. There's erosion, there's the loss of organic carbon, loss of soil biodiversity, compaction, salinization, and desertification. Let's look at each of these in turn. So before we do that, we got to understand how modern farming is done. So most farming today is done in a large scale, and basically what happens is we use heavy equipment in order to farm lots and lots of land to produce lots and lots of harvest, so we can feed lots and lots of people. There are we're getting close to 8 billion people in the world. It's hard to feed them all. Now, so basically, what we tend to do is we start out by taking heavy equipment, which turns over the soil and basically prepares it for planting by basically taking it and breaking up all the roots that are in it and the make it sort of loosening it up, flipping it over, and leaving it bare. And then we put seeds in these furrows that have been produced. Then what we do is after this, to get those seeds to grow, we try to, plants need water to support growth. So we irrigate them by spraying water on them or flooding them with water. But basically we put water on them in order to get the plants to grow. Now, often we want them to grow pretty fast and fully, so we put fertilizers down on top of them to provide them with the nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium that they need in order to grow. Then we find that other things want to eat them, and weeds want to outcompete them, so we have to keep down the bugs and the weeds by spraying them with herbicides and insecticides to try to ensure that the crop has a better chance to grow than the weeds or the bugs. And then when all is said and done, we harvest the crop, and then we till we basically get rid of all the plant material, and we till the dirt back under and get it ready to plant again. So that's how we farm. Now, that is not how we used to farm. It's a fairly recent approach to farming that happened starting in the 1960s, and it was great that it did because it allowed us to feed a growing population of the world. And the world population exploded after World War II, and had we not converted to this form of farming, we wouldn't have been able to feed the world. But there are a number of problems that happen as a result of it. The first and most alarming one is erosion. So erosion is basically can be caused by either wind or water, but when wind or water flow across the land, they can carry the soil away and then deposit in places like the ocean where it doesn't do us any good. I mean, if it's deposited anywhere but a farmland, it really doesn't do us any good at that point, and that soil is now lost. Every kilogram of soil that isn't here, or every square meter, however you want to measure it, is a square meter of soil that the world has lost, at least humans have lost forever. In our time on this world, we're never getting it back. Okay. And so having this happen is calamitous. Now, one of the main way it happens is when we have bare soils. That's the problem, people. When soils are bare, they are very vulnerable to erosion. So a farmer tills the soil, and then it rains. When it rains, that rain just the runoff just washes across it, carries it down. You can see the muddiness of it. It's just carrying away soil. You can see how it's cutting down and eroding down. So this bare land is a problem, especially for either rainwater, especially, but also irrigation. You know, if it, when irrigation water, if it's done the wrong way, it lands on the soil, it causes it to erode. The other thing that can happen is the wind. So when the wind picks up, when you have these like long open areas of land and the wind starts blowing across it, it just picks up the soil and carries it like thousands of kilometers away. Now, the part that it tends to pick up is not the sand. The part it tends to pick up is the clay and the silt. You know, and just like silt and clay stay suspended in water longer, they stay suspended in air longer. So what happens is this process tends to leave the soil too high in sand, which doesn't hold water very well, doesn't hold nutrients very well. So it definitely what we call degrades the soil and carries a bit of it away too, right? Uh, and so one thing that people can do to try to reduce this is plant what are called windbreaks. So instead of having this giant opening area of land, you can plant rows of trees every so often, like maybe every few hundred meters, and that slows down the wind so it never picks up enough speed to cause this problem. Now, this little side note that I think is kind of fascinating is the wind erosion, as though we see it as a negative in terms of human impact on soil conservation. It is a natural process that happens in parts of the world that are arid and don't have much in the way of surface vegetation. And a classic one is the Sahara Desert of northern Africa. The winds here is in like we're like here, like we're in about 20-degree latitude, so we have trade winds, and they tend to blow across here, pick up this debris, and the silt gets and the mud gets carried across the ocean and deposits not just in the Atlantic Ocean, but it actually makes it. They've realized in just recent years makes it all the way over to the Amazon rainforest. And here's why that's important. One of the components in there is phosphorus, which is just a nutrient that is based on minerals, right? And so it basically seeds the ocean and the Amazon rainforest with fertilizers, and this drives important ecosystems that without this they wouldn't thrive the way they do. Kind of cool, isn't it? That the Amazon rainforest is linked, and it depends on the supply of phosphorus from across the ocean. So how do we prevent soil erosion from happening? Well, it turns out one of the best things we can do is plant what's called a cover crop. So, and this is like a new idea, and they're trying very hard, or governmental organizations trying very hard to get farmers to switch to this. Okay, it's not how they're used to doing things, but the idea of a cover crop, in this case, they have clover, which is good for other reasons. So basically, you have this low-growing crop, and the roots are going to hold down the soil, and then the leaves cover up so the wind can't blow on it. The wind doesn't get down to it. So basically, we're conserving the soil, preventing erosion by having low-growing plants there. But then we have the plants that we want, a cereal crop usually, which sometimes has a lot of starch. In this case, wheat grows up through it. And now the trick is, though, if you till the land, now you have exposed soil. So that's really the problem. We lose soil when we till it. So the idea is we should go towards what's called no-till agriculture, where instead of turning the land over like this and exposing dirt, there's a way of just drilling the seeds down into it, and then they grow up through the cover crop. And then this cover crop also helps to hold back weeds. So it's a really cool idea. It's fairly recent, and it's just starting to catch on with the farming community. Now, another problem that happens with soils is the loss of organic soil carbon. So organic carbon basically is derived from the decomposition of roots and plant matter that falls down on top of the soil. So remember, the top surface of the soil is very rich in organic material, and as these decompose, they cycle the nutrients back into the soil. The phosphorus and the nitrogen go back into the soil. This provides nutrients for both next year's plants, but also let's not forget there's a whole population of organisms here, especially bacteria, especially the bacteria that are associated with the nitrogen cycle. They need the nutrients present in these uh, uh, carbon compounds, these organic carbon compounds, in order to survive. But what happens is when farmers tend to harvest their fields, they tend to take everything with them down to the dirt, right? So the plant grows up, it took nutrients out of the soil. If I just took the part of the plant I wanted, the part that I was going to eat, and left the rest of the plant there and then let it decay, we'd be okay. But that's not what they often do. They often take that away and they'll sell it. They'll sell the wheat to a company that's going to make bread or flour out of it. But then the stalks of it they'll sell as food for animals, as hay. Okay, and so they're basically, there's no organic carbon going back into the soil. So as a result, over time, you get less and less organic soil carbon, and then that basically impacts both the plants that you're going to grow, which now need a lot of chemical fertilizers, but also causes the soil bacteria to diminish. How do you prevent the loss of organic carbon in the soil? Again, no-till is the way to go, because no-till means I'm leaving plants in there. I'm not taking the plants out, and then the plants, they die back. So here's last year's growth dying back, returning its nutrients to the soil. The roots of last year's crop are still in the soil, so not only are they preventing erosion from happening, but they're also decomposing the soil and providing nutrients to both this year's crop plants and the microbes in the soil that are so important in cycling nutrients. And there's other things in the soil that are also important. And one of the things that's important in soils is the many different organisms there, especially, we already talked about the bacterial components, but there's also the burrowing organisms. So we have insects, we have worms, we have rodents, and these things have a tendency to go through the soil and break it up like this. And what that does is that keeps it from becoming compacted, and it allows the soil to be aerated. It allows rainwater to infiltrate. So it's very important to maintain a fairly low density soil, and that's hard to do mechanically, but these organisms do it for us. So it's important to have these organisms in the soil to make that happen. But what happens is we tend to lose soil biodiversity with modern farming practices, primarily through the use of insecticides and herbicides, particularly insecticides. So what happens is we're trying to prevent bugs from eating the crop, so we spray these toxins on it. And it does a great job of that. But unfortunately, what happens is it gets into the soil, and then it tends to kill things in the soil, like basically it makes the soil dead. So like the things like worms that would normally be crawling around eating stuff, there's nothing for them to eat, so then they die. So they're not turning up the soil, and then the nitrogen cycle bacteria, they die too. So basically, we end up with this soil that's almost dead. It's just primarily just minerals, and that's not really how life works. The plants need more than that. Now, soil compaction, which those organisms help prevent, is definitely another problem that is encountered. And so basically what happens is when soil becomes compacted, the pore space gets squeezed shut. So as we go this way, we're getting less and less pore space for more and more compaction. And as we get less and less pore space, there's less connectivity between the pores. So not only do we lose the ability to retain water, like all this water that you're retaining here, you can't retain over here. We're also losing the ability for water to pass from the surface downwards, because we're squeezing shut those openings between the pores. So we're losing permeability, and this leads to water logging, right? So that means the water can't flow down. It gets trapped here. Even though there's not much in the pores, what's there can't move. The roots suffocate, the bacteria suffocate, and we get these problems, of sterile soil as a result of that. So we really don't want to compact soil, and it's really hard to undo it once you've done it. And how does it happen? Well, one way it happens, apart from killing the burrowing organisms we talked about, is by driving heavy farm equipment across the land, especially if we do that when the soil is wet. So using farm equipment on wet soil is just a terrible idea. But unfortunately, farmers, a lot of times they have a brief weather window, and they try to do what they try to do the job they want to do with this heavy equipment at a time when it really was ill-advised. Another thing that threatens soils is what's called salinization, or the salting of the soil. And basically, this is just the way the soils will build up salt in them over time, even though I'm obviously not spraying salt water on them. But what happens is, as the soil becomes saltier and saltier, if you remember osmosis from biology, what happens is water in a semi-permeable membrane, like a cell, is always going to flow towards where it's saltier. Okay, and so if it should be saltier inside the plant than it is outside, so water will flow into the root. Well, when this happens to the soil, water flows the other way. So it flows out of the root cells. Those root cells die, and the plants die. That's why you just can't grow things in soil like this once it's become salinized. And that's, getting rid of that is a real mess. Okay. So what causes it to happen? Well, it's kind of weird. So when you like drink out of a mountain stream, for instance, we call it fresh water. But the thing is, there are ions in it. Where did the salt in the ocean come from? It came from rivers. So river water doesn't taste salty. That's because the ion concentration in fresh water is very low. Too low for us to taste, too low for it to be a problem for plants. But what happens is, in nature, it rains when it's cloudy, so there's usually not a whole lot of evaporation in a rain event under most circumstances. But when we irrigate, we tend to do it on sunny days as well. So what happens is, we pump water onto the crop that has a small amount of these ions in it, and we want it to infiltrate, but unfortunately there's a lot of evaporation happening, and that leaves these ions in the soil, and over time those ions build up enough, they start forming salt crystals. So the real problem here is that we're irrigating in sunny days in arid environments. That's really where you get it. Areas that are fairly dry, have a lot of sun, and we're using frequent irrigation. So how do you prevent salinization? Well, the best way is use a better method of irrigation. And they use a lot here in Korea, I'm happy to say. Even though we're not that prone towards salinization. Well, we're fairly dry, but we're not that arid. But the deal is, drip irrigation is the way to go. Drip irrigation is expensive, but it's really cool. You have these tubes that have little holes in the drip water. So instead of spraying water out over the entire crop, I'm just dripping it right onto the plant roots. And so two things happen. I'm using a lot less water, so there's a lot less sodium and chloride ions going into my fields. But the other thing is, there's a lot less evaporation happening because there's a lot less water. So it's definitely way better in many regards, but when it comes to salinization, drip irrigation is the way to go. And you see a lot of drip irrigation here in Korea. And the last topic is desertification. So that basically means converting arid lands that do support plant life into deserts that really don't support much more than, say, cacti. And so what tends to cause it is, if you have a region of the planet that's very arid to begin with, but still has enough vegetation to, vegetation can hold moisture in the soil, and basically you have a healthy soil. But what happens is, if I overgraze, if I send too many cattle or goats or whatever out to graze on the plants, then I end up with this bare soil, and bare soils are always the problem. So I have bare soils. Now I get lots of evaporation, and the next thing you know, the topsoil blows away. It carries what few clay particles I had in there that were going to be able to retain water, and so the soil basically gets to the point where it's just not compatible to plant life anymore. And what was, what we call arable land, farmable land, it gets turned into desert. So look at this map here, okay? And it's worth noting that it's not that hard for arid land that's farmable to turn into desert, but it's really hard to get desert to turn back. It's remediating that, as far as I'm aware, has never been successfully done. There's a lot of interest in it, and here's why. Look at this map. These are places in the world. Red means that you're at high risk of desertification. Here, where they're chopping down the Amazon rainforest, sub-Saharan Africa, India, the southern part of Eurasia. Okay, so there's a lot of places in the orange are places where there is a moderate or fairly high risk. Okay, so there's a lot of the world that is in danger of being unfarmable. Look at the amount. Look at the percent of the planet we're talking about here. It's a huge amount, and a lot of this here, like this, we're not even talking about because it's not something we use anyway. Okay, like this is already desert. Okay, so it's a serious issue and one that needs to be dealt with. Now, just to throw this into perspective, human population has been increasing from the 1700s on. Okay, so population increases. What happened here? Well, after World War II, the human population started to skyrocket, and so people invented these farming techniques we've been talking about, the mechanized farming, where we use fertilizers and we use pesticides and so on. And basically, we've been able to keep up the food supply with human population. But if human population continues to grow, we're going to have a hard time feeding them all, and we need every acre of soil that we've got. Now, Now, we don't know what's going to happen with human population. Maybe it'll do this, maybe it'll do this, maybe it'll continue to skyrocket up. We'll have a different unit. A couple units from now, we'll talk about populations. But the point is, human population at this point is going up fairly rapidly, and our soils are going down fairly rapidly. And that's not a good situation to find ourselves in. So if we look at a map of soil degradation, that just means taking it all into account, whether it's compaction, salinization, desertification. When you make a map of that, what you see is there's a problem with the soil on our planet, people. And so what that means is, and environmental science is always about this, if you don't know there's a problem, you won't fix the problem. So you have to know there's a problem in order to fix it. Once you know the problem is there, you've got to convince the population of the planet that this is something that needs to be addressed. And so now you know we have a problem with soils. They're more important than most people realize, and they must be conserved in order for future generations to continue to enjoy this beautiful planet of ours. See ya.